Welcome to No Greater Love, the Four Chaplains and the Sinking of the Dorchester. This program is sponsored by the World War II Veterans Committee. Chapter 2, Abandoned Ship.
Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them.
In October 1918, I was captain of a submarine in the Mediterranean near Malta. In a dark night, I met a British convoy, and I attacked and I sank a ship. But the chance would have been very much greater if there had been a lot of submarines. That's why the idea of a wolf pack to put the submarines together that they could attack together was very impressive, and I never had forgotten this idea.
Hello, I'm Gene Pell. The Navy was the weakest of Germany's armed services when World War II erupted in 1939. Under Admiral Karl Dönitz, the submarine arm expanded to make possible the only effective German action at sea. But it was one which came perilously close to winning the war. U-boats hunted in Dönitz's wolf packs, attacking at night in the mid-Atlantic. Thousands of ships were sunk, and millions of tons of supplies never made it to beleaguered Britain. Winston Churchill wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." 1 month after Pearl Harbor, Operation Drumbeat extended the submarine war to the shores of North America. In a mere 6 months, German raiders sank nearly 400 ships in U.S. waters. The sinking of just one freighter could be equivalent to the loss of goods carried by 4 railroad trains of 75 cars each. Then there was the human cost. The Battle of the Atlantic would claim 80,000 Allied lives.
It was a new way of thinking about the boundaries of conflict, somewhat like realization following 9/11 that no place is safe from a determined enemy.
Colonel John Brinsfield is a U.S. Army Chaplain Corps historian.
Less than 30 years before, unrestricted submarine warfare had been regarded as a war crime. But by 1943, submarine attacks on the merchant ships, troop transports, and cargo vessels were daily occurrences. The rules of war had been twisted to allow for less discrimination, a symptom of the extended battlefield which characterized World War II.
Admiral Thomas Moore.
The Atlantic War was a submarine war, and the Germans were raising hell with the merchant ships they were sinking on their way to Europe from the United States. And at the outset, the Germans were very successful. Admiral King almost got fired for the number of ships that were being sunk, and it was nip and tuck.
Naval historian Paul Stilwell.
One of the big features that the United States used to protect ships, both troop transports and cargo ships, was to arrange them in convoys. These convoys would steam in columns, and then they would have an escort of destroyers or other Navy-type ships, plus Coast Guard cutters. These ships would be equipped with sonar to detect the submarines. They would also act kind of like sheepdogs to range out on the flanks of the convoy and keep the ships herded in together for mutual protection.
The Atlantic was the only route for the United States to take the war to Germany. Millions of American soldiers packed onto ships bound for European battlefields. Fast transatlantic troop convoys, heavily escorted, ran the wolf packs without casualties. Not a single troop ship in a fast convoy was sunk by U-boat attack. Taking a leaf out of the World War I experience, the big luxury liners also moved huge numbers of soldiers across the Atlantic. Too fast to be in convoy, or even for an escort ship, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth each carried 20,000 troops in a single crossing and never lost a man. But moving so large a force was a monumental effort, and every available ship was pressed into service, particularly when it came to shorter runs in the North Atlantic. A former coastal luxury liner, the 20-year-old Dorchester, was taken out of mothballs and converted into an Army transport. All non-critical amenities were removed, and nearly 1,000 cots were crammed into every available space. In early 1943, the Dorchester, 2 freighters, and 3 U.S. Coast Guard cutters convoyed to Greenland.
The run-of-the-mill North Atlantic convoy was a mix of supply ships and troop transports. And I always felt this was the most dangerous convoy because you had some enormous compromises in the convoy. You might have an oiler or a tanker, a supply ship, and a troop transport. And unfortunately, that convoy would be moving at the rate of the slowest ship.
World War II Navy Captain Franklin Daly.
The Dorchester was in one of these mixed convoys, and it was a very, I would say, an unfortunate mix of ships. The Dorchester itself could make good speed. It could have been convoyed in one of the all-troop convoys. It could have kept up. It's a 14-knot ship. Unfortunately, on the particular mission in which it was lost, it was not headed for a European port or the British Isles. It was headed for Greenland, and those were compromise convoys where they would mix the slow and faster ships and all move at the speed of the slowest ship.
The Dorchester had made 5 other trips going back and forth, and a couple of times they came very close to being sunk, but they weren't.
Dan Kurzman is the author of a forthcoming book about the Four Chaplains.
The Dorchester was just luckier before because the Dorchester had a sister ship, which was sunk the first time it tried to get through the same waters, and the many other ships were also sunk. So it was really dangerous.
The young frightened soldiers on board the Dorchester were in need of a strong shoulder to lean on and a firm voice to encourage them. In their midst moved 4 chaplains, beacons of hope in a sea of danger, who put aside their own fears and uncertainties to minister to their flock. The Reverend George Fox, Rabbi Alexander Good, the Reverend Clark Poling, and Father John Washington supported each other as they meted out their strength to the men.
John Washington, he was a wonderful priest, a really loving man, but a fighting guy. He was a street fighter, and the men really loved him aboard. That's what I was told. And he was constantly telling stories. You know, he was this Irishman. He apparently inherited this ability to tell all kinds of stories from his father, who told endless stories about Ireland and the fighting there and the history there and all. And so he told a story about everything. You'd mention something, with whatever the subject, he would say, well, I know a story about that. And he was very funny, but he got his points across with humor. He had a typical Irish wit and was a very lovable man and was also loved by the other 3.
John Washington grew up poor, scrappy, and determined in the toughest section of Newark, New Jersey. One of 9 children born to an Irish immigrant family, he was blessed with a sunny disposition, a beautiful singing voice, and a love for music. He also loved a good fight and was the leader of a street gang when he was called to the priesthood. He was ordained in 1935 and began active duty as an Army chaplain in May 1942. Now he joined his fellow chaplains and 900 other men on board the Dorchester as it sailed south of Greenland into the area that Allied plane cover could not reach, the Black Pit.
On February 2nd, the captain of the ship spoke to us, and he said, there is a submarine following us. We're 90 miles from Greenland, and if we make it overnight, we will have air protection from the base, which will bring us into port safely. I wish us all good luck.
Well, we were in the 3rd deck down, cramped, maybe 40, 50 men, I think 2 or 3 bunks high, and we were told there's at least 5 submarines, a wolf pack is trailing us. And the chaplains came through to visit us, talked to the men there, see how you boys are doing. Everybody, you know, talking back and forth. They was asking different men where you're from.
On the ship, those chaplains were around keeping good things going even before this accident happened. They were building good relationship and keeping the men's spirits up and their morals up, trying to keep their morale going.
The evening of February the 2nd, we were told over the loudspeaker that there would be a party, and the chaplains would be there to entertain us.
Rumor had it, and we suspected because of the fact that the sailors, they weren't mingling with the soldiers like they usually did every evening. They were on duty because there was a rumor that we'd run into a pack of submarines.
They had spotted the submarine. They knew it was out there, but they couldn't catch it.
We were told to keep our life belts handy and stay fully dressed.
Your gloves, your coat, your life preserver, your hats, your shoes, your socks. Sleep with them.
We're supposed to have our life preservers on. We're supposed to sleep with them on all the time. But we didn't. We hung them like on a peg there on the wall.
Sleeping with a life jacket on at that time was a little difficult. Pieces of cork and a canvas vest. Not the most comfortable thing in the world. Mine is still hanging on the edge of my bunk.
At supper time, at dinner time, all the chaplains told us to mind our P's and Q's the way we're supposed to.
My contact with Father Washington was at Mass and confession. I was struck by his soft-spoken humanity and devotion to his faith.
There was an underlying strength to the man that he was going to do God's work and take care of his men, no matter what happened.
Sometime during the evening of February 2nd, probably around 7 o'clock at night, I was with Father Washington in his cabin. I was having him hear my confession. We Catholics, especially in times like that, think it's a good idea to go to confession. Later on in the evening, I went on watch.
When you was watching me, you stood out there for 2 hours. We had fur-lined jacket, fur hood, and we come in and just be covered with ice because the water come on you and it was so cold.
About 45 minutes to an hour is about all you can stand out there.
You reported anything at all that you thought looked strange. If the log came out, you seen a log out there, you reported that. Then they reported to the Coast Guard cutters. And they would take off around and they would search this area. I know one guy, he called him there's a piece of wood out there. Well, I'm glad it was, but they got us anyway.
It was a cat and mouse game all the time.
Captain Franklin Daly.
The Navy emphasizes 2 words, eternal vigilance. And the whole name of the game in convoy work was vigilance. You had to be alert 24 hours a day, at night or in fog, and the lookouts were the first line of defense in convoy work. Submarines waited at the Greenland intersection. I mean, they were just sitting there waiting for you to come along. And the story of sinkings was a matter of only days apart. One convoy after another would be attacked, and at least one ship would be sunk 150 miles south or southwest of Greenland.
The Dorchester and the 2 freighters sailed in a zigzag pattern to confuse the stalking U-boat. Out ahead and on the flanks patrolled the Coast Guard cutters Tampa, Escanaba, and Comanche. The United States Navy was given command of the Coast Guard at the beginning of the war, intended to retain control of high-profile operations while assigning routine duties to the Coast Guard. Many of these assignments were backhanded compliments to the Coast Guard's experience with merchant shipping and to their superior seamanship in the higher latitudes of the North Atlantic. Similarly, the Navy reserved for Navy ships the most modern equipment, such as radar.
The submarine skipper had an open quarter. That is, the whole starboard quarter was open as far as his approach was concerned, and all he had to do was to get in fairly close. And since those ships had no radar, could not detect him at night unless they could see him, he was able, with his 11 or 12 knot surface speed, to move up on the convoy, which was only making about 9 knots or less. So he could call the shots as far as getting in position.
And then we come up to February 3rd. I was on sonar watch. We were getting all types of what we call false echoes. Some coming from the bottom. Sometimes you can get them off of a whale. We were just getting a lot of hash.
I was on lookout. I happened to have been looking aft or to the rear of the Dorchester at that time, and suddenly I remembered the sky seemed to light up in this orange-red light.
And at 5 minutes to 1 in the morning, I heard a loud explosion on sonar.
And at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, we heard this tremendous explosion.
There was a terrible crash, then the explosion. I was talking with a group of my buddies that had come up through basic training with him. One of the boys asked if he could borrow my pen so he could write in his diary. So I gave him the pen, and it was about that time we got hit. And last I saw him, he jumped off the side of the ship. With a cork life preserver, he died when he hit the water, I'm sure. As far as I know, he still got my pen with him.
I was with 2 or 3 other GIs sitting on a bunk in a stateroom on the starboard side, and we were playing rummy. Just as I was about to holler rummy, everything went black.
You couldn't see anything. Bunks went like a deck of cards.
I was in my bunk when it happened and was knocked out for quite a few minutes. And when I came to, I walked outside. The side of the ship was open, so I could walk right out.
Many of the soldiers were blown out from the first blast, went right in where they were sleeping, through a big hole. A lot of the soldiers instantly was gone.
Tremendous explosion. It put a hole right up through the ship, like swallowing the whole ocean at one time. It was terrible.
And when it hit, you could feel the ship go up a little and then settle back down the water.
And then we headed in toward the Dorchester to see if we could pick up the submarine, because we were only told to find the submarine because we realized that unless he was put out of commission or sunk or driven down deep, that he would stay there and torpedo the rest of us. So the first thing we did was search out for him.
In wartime, as our commanding officer said, our first duty is to seek out the enemy. So the Comanche was sent out after the sub.
It was first a feeling of relief or luck. We have hit the target, but at the same moment we understood that now we are the ones who are hunted. It was a feeling of deep fear and strongest tension, especially when we listened to the sonar. Very hard for us.
The Escanaba did not have radar. The Tampa was the senior officer afloat, so he directed them to begin rescue operations.
Upon the explosion of the torpedo, it was complete blackness. And needless to say, there was panic.
I would say close to panic. People were jumping off the ship. People were running back and forth.
I heard a lot of screaming.
At first, there was a lot of commotion. Everybody was running around. A lot of people were screaming, howling for their buddies and stuff like that.
They were pretty well hit. They were mortally hit, and it began to list right quick.
And then our lieutenant told us that we were to abandon ship. There was nothing we could do about it. We couldn't fire off, and there was no targets to fire at. So we were to abandon ship.
In less than half an hour, the ocean would flow across the deck of the Dorchester. Amid all of the confusion and panic, the inescapable fog of war, four chaplains dispersed among the soldiers to calm the frightened, tend the wounded, and guide the disoriented to safety.
No Greater Love, the Four Chaplains and the Sinking of the Dorchester will return in a moment. Welcome back to the special anniversary program, No Greater Love, the Four Chaplains and the Sinking of the Dorchester. Your host is Gene Pell.
Beaten Nazis may take comfort in reflecting that no army, fleet, or other unit in World War II, with the exception of their own people who murdered defenseless civilians, wrought such destruction and misery as the U-boats. Samuel Eliot Morison.
U-223 fired 3 torpedoes. One hit. It punched a hole through the Dorchester, exploding its massive warhead deep inside. The aging luxury liner was far from its holiday runs to the Caribbean's warm harbors. Now star shells, lobbed high by scrambling Coast Guard cutters, illuminated the hellish scene. Dead and dying servicemen floated in the freezing North Atlantic and littered the deck of the stricken ship. Some had been blown to pieces. Others were burned or crushed. Ammonia gas poisoned the air. Thick fuel oil fouled the sea. Disoriented survivors of the initial blast poured out from the holds. The inrushing ocean quickly took their places. Hundreds of young lives clung to what amounted to no more than 5,000 tons of sinking flotsam that was getting smaller and smaller. The coming flood did not panic those whose strength was buoyed by the word and grace of God. The four chaplains drew on their unquenchable faith to instill courage, hope, and peace to the frantic men around them. Chaplain George Fox knew how brutal war could be. He experienced its barbarism firsthand in the century's first great conflagration.
Normally, he wouldn't have been accepted in the Second War because of his wounds. And yet he managed to get in by saying he was fine, this and that, and he talked his way into it, even though he should have been turned down.
Dan Kurzman is the author of a forthcoming book about the four chaplains.
When he was only 17 years old, he lied about his age in order to get into World War I, and he went to the front, and he won the Silver Star for going into an area that was gassed and carrying a couple of men to safety. And on several other occasions, he also took terrible risks in order to save people. He was in an ambulance unit. And he was seriously wounded, not only from the gas, but from other wounds that he received.
George Fox returned to Altoona, Pennsylvania, and was working as an accountant when he heard God's call to the ministry. He went back to school and was ordained a Methodist minister in 1934.
And you'd think that such a man wouldn't even dream of volunteering to go into another war. And yet when World War II came, and by that time he was a minister, he decided at the age of 41 that he wanted to go back and fight in World War II.
He said goodbye to his 7-year-old daughter, Mary Elizabeth, on August 8, 1942. The same day, his son enlisted in the Marine Corps. Chaplain Fox told his wife, "I've got to go. I know what our boys are about to face. They need me."
Well, after we were torpedoed, everybody jumped out of the bunk, run around banging each other.
The screw, the propeller of this ship was coming up out of the water. We had listed and rolled so much to the starboard side. The propeller was up there, and some of the men were jumping in the dark and were hitting that screw.
I'm not sure I'd call it chaos, but there was utter confusion.
Complete confusion. Every man for themselves is the way I look at it.
The confusion that ran through that ship was fantastic because nobody knew what to do.
When we got on top of the deck, it was dark, no light, nothing. And everybody was running around, screaming and all that going on,
I heard voices. I heard people saying, "Stay calm." And I learned later on it was the Four Chaplains.
And I could tell they were chaplains, the way they talked and the way they were handling the men. And they did a lot of good to save many a man's life, I'm sure.
This way! Rough, here, come on! They were out there doing their job. And they were out there on deck, and I could visualize that some of those kids were running up and down. Oh my God, I don't have a life preserver.
One of the boys had the chaplain almost by the neck and hanging on to him and just screaming. And this chaplain was shaking him some and tried to talk to him and tell him to get on the fall line, keep a prayer on your lips, and I'll be praying for you.
In the center of the deck were 4 Army chaplains standing in a semicircle. Their voices were raised in prayer for the salvation of the ship and the safety of its human cargo.
A sailor, reeling from the cold, headed back toward his cabin. "Where are you going?" an officer called out. "My gloves, to get my gloves," the man sputtered. The officer held out his hand. "Here, take these. I have 2 pair." Rabbi Good had decided that he would not leave the Dorchester. I'm Gene Pell. Please join me for our next program.
You have been listening to No Greater Love, the Four Chaplains and the Sinking of the Dorchester. Unidentified voices in this program were those of Dorchester survivors Michael Warish, Ben Epstein, Wilmot Harklerode, William Kramer, Daniel O'Keefe, Walter Miller, James Erdley, Roy Summers, David Labadie, and Michael Calandrello, Coast Guard rescuers Dick Swanson and Captain Ralph Curry, and U-boat crewman Bosch Poser. No Greater Love was sponsored by the World War II Veterans Committee and the Chapel of Four Chaplains, and was produced by Radio America in association with MediaWorks and the Immortal Chaplains Foundation.